Hello, we want to welcome you to our Bible study on March the 29th, Sunday, 2020. We're glad that you're here with us this morning. This is the Randolph Church of Christ. We are conducting our Bible study via Facebook Live this morning because of the quarantine. The leaders that we have are telling us that we need to limit our social distancing to 6 feet apart when we're together and to less than groups of 10. So we are not going to have our service as normal at 10 o'clock, but we are going to have our service broadcast, at least the sermon, at 10 o'clock. So if you want to tune in for the 10 o'clock sermon, you can do that at 10 o'clock. But right now we're going to study from 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5. If you have your Bible, you might want to open it to 2 Kings chapter 5, because here we have a very interesting event that occurred in the Old Testament. There was a man in the nation of Syria. Syria was very powerful back when this event occurred. In fact, Syria is a very old country. It has gone through many transitions, and it has changed on the world stage as far as its power. Sometimes it's been very strong on the world stage and sometimes a very minor element. But during this time, they were very powerful, and they were north of the kingdom of Israel. And there was a prophet in the land of Israel during these days known by the name of Elisha. Elisha had been the protege of Elijah, the great prophet of God, who still to this day reminds us of what a great prophet was all about. Back in the chapter of Matthew 17, we see Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John. His clothes began to glisten. They were white, whiter than any fuller could whiten them, and appearing with Jesus were Moses and Elijah. Moses had been dead for centuries, and Elijah had been dead for centuries, and yet they were very much alive in the Spirit, and they appeared with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Peter, James, and John witnessed this. Well, Elijah had gone to heaven in a whirlwind, and he had gone from heaven had gone to heaven not having died, but was transferred to heaven. And on his way, his protege, the one he was training, Elisha, watched him go into heaven. And Elijah dropped his mantle down, and Elisha picked it up. And Elisha became the prophet following the great ministry of Elijah. Their names sound alike, so we have to distinguish between Elijah, the mentor, and Elisha, the protege. But Elisha became a great prophet just like Elijah. See, I'm getting them mixed up too. Well, Elisha is in this event in 2 Kings chapter 5. By this time, he has become the great man of God in Israel, a great prophet. And there was a man in Syria, just north of Israel, and in that kingdom there was a commander there by the name of Naaman. He's described as being a very great man. And so I want to go and read the text, 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria, and he was also a mighty man of valor." Now that describes a man who had been quite successful, and even the Lord had worked through Naaman to give victory to Syria. So here we see God's concern not only for his people Israel, but he worked with other nations as well. God is no respecter of persons. He had a special mission for Israel, but he did not forget the other nations such as Syria. And Naaman was used by God to have a great victory in Syria. And it was because he was a mighty man of valor, he was great, and he had all of these distinctions. But I want to go back and read verse 1, and I want to include the last phrase. Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now let that sink in just a moment. Do you know what leprosy is? Leprosy still exists today. We have means through medications to treat leprosy, but it still affects people in poor countries. And when it affects people in developed countries, it's still a terrible disease to deal with. Leprosy is something even today that a person does not want to have. Literally, leprosy causes the rotting and decaying of the flesh while a person is still alive. It is a terrible disease. And back then in 2 Kings 5, there was no cure according to the natural means. It would take a supernatural power to cure leprosy. I thought the reason this would be a good topic for today is because we're dealing with something that's unknown today. The COVID-19 outbreak, the coronavirus, is something that we're struggling to deal with, struggling to understand. Are we underreacting? Are we overreacting? These are questions to deal with. Our leaders are grappling with these things. We've certainly not seen anything in our lifetime like this. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in 1919. That was a year after the outbreak of 1918. In 1918, they had a terrible flu outbreak that killed many, many people across the globe. So this is not the first pandemic. There have been pandemics, epidemics, there have been pestilences, there have been plagues in history, and we've read about these things, and we've tried to learn how they dealt with them back then. But leprosy, like the coronavirus, had no cure at the time that this event took place, and people were distressed about it. When a person had leprosy in the days of Elisha and Naaman, a person had to be quarantined. They had colonies of lepers, and lepers would live together, and if they ever had to go out into public, they had to cover their face and to cry, "Unclean, unclean." Imagine the stigma and just the horror of having to deal with this, and then being around others. The only people you could be around are other lepers who were terribly diseased and sick. It must have been something terrible to live with. It was living while your body was decaying, and a person would seek death often, and it would not come. Their body would literally fall apart. And people with leprosy longed for a cure. We find that people with leprosy were among the most needy people. Now here's a great man who has gone up the ranks, and he is the great man of Syria, a commander, a great and honorable man in the eyes of the king of Syria. And yet he has leprosy. Perhaps in his battles he had come across people and had gotten this as a contagion, and now he is a leper. There's no cure. What will he do? Verse 2, the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. She waited on Naaman's wife. I remember when my little girls were little, I felt that one of my great privileges was to look after them and to raise them up. But I felt a keen responsibility to protect my children. And we were always aware of where they were and what they were doing, especially around strangers. Imagine that you have a young girl in the land of Israel, and in a raid, the Syrians come down and take your little girl, and they take her to a foreign land where she becomes a slave. That's what happened to this young girl. And she had evidently been trained in such a way that she remembered her people and remembered the great things that had gone on in her country of Israel. So the Syrians had gone out on raids, took this young girl from the land of Israel to Syria, and she waited on Naaman's wife. So she was in a very good position to wait on the commander of Syria and to wait on his wife. Verse 3, then she said to her mistress, this is the little girl, if only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy. Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. And this young girl remembered Elisha, the prophet who was in Samaria. And she knew he had the power from God to heal leprosy. This is only supernatural power. There's everyday natural occurrences, and that's what we see every day. Nature following natural law. God set this in motion. That's how things operate in the normal, everyday living. But there is something also in the Old and New Testament where God stood above his own laws and inserted his power in a supernatural way. It's something above and beyond nature. We call these miracles. I know people today, they'll call a touchdown or a three-pointer in basketball. They'll say that's a miracle shot, or that was a miracle play. Or they'll call natural childbirth, as special as that is. They'll call it a miracle, the miracle of childbirth. But that's a misuse of the term miracle. Miracles are supernatural powers that can only point to God as its source. Because God, who established natural law, only has the power to suspend or override his natural law with supernatural power. So this young girl remembered the prophet who had this kind of power, even over leprosy. Imagine having supernatural power today. We could cure COVID-19. Now, this will show you how fake a lot of these pretenders are today, who claim to have supernatural power. If they had it, they could cure COVID-19, coronavirus. But they don't have miracle power. They're pretenders. They are making merchandise of people in the name of religion. Supernatural power can actually cure things like leprosy, and this young girl knew it. Verse 4, and Naaman went in and told his master, that's the king of Syria, saying, thus and thus said the girl who is from the land of Israel. So the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing, equivalent today of about $4 million. The king wanted his commander cured. Verse 6, then he brought the letter to the king of Israel. So this is the king of Syria sending a letter to the king of Israel. Here's the letter. Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy. The king of Syria, who's more powerful, is telling this less powerful king of Israel, you cure my commander. He backed it up with money, of course. Well, verse 7, it happened when the king of Israel read the letter that he tore his clothes and said, am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him